Hey, Master Gardener trainees, welcome to Mistaken Identities Part 2. And if it sounds foreboding, it probably is to the average homeowner that might approach you about some of these issues. And what you're going to learn here in just a handful of slides are some of the most commonly mistaken normal parts of plants and some of the parts of the environment that people think are parasites or disease in their plants. And you're going to be armed with the exact amount of information and the details that you need to put their fears at ease. So let's move on. To our first mistaken identity. These are lichens, very, very common in our environment. If you go out into your yard, I promise you're going to see some of at least one, if not all three of these different forms, from crustose to fruticose forms on rocks, on the ground in some cases, definitely on the bark on trees. You're going to see some that have different colors here, fruticose, some that are crusty, and some that are very foliose, look like small plants growing off the side of bark. And people are absolutely convinced that these are doing harm to their plants. In fact, these are symbiotic associations between fungi and algae. They really don't have anything at all to do with the plants. They're just using the plant as support. Now, will you find these very frequently on plants that are losing vigor and have few leaves or branches? Yes, because it's easier for them to establish a home there, just because there's nothing really in their way. But they are not feeding whatsoever or harming the plants or even animals for that matter. They can even be very important food sources for some animals in the environment. And in fact, a environment that's devoid of lichens is usually an indicator that the environment is not very healthy. You want a diversity of these in the environment. So again, these are nothing bad whatsoever. Fungi and algae living together in what I call a symbiotic association. That's where two or more organisms can live together, sometimes one inside of another, like in this case. And they almost create a whole nother body. The lichen and the fungi that creates this one, for example, here in the middle, look nothing like this. But living together creates something that looks very different. And they even give a species name too. A symbiotic association, nobody's being harmed. Everybody is benefiting. And in fact, they're better off together than alone trying to survive in the environment. Very similar to the symbiotic or beneficial bacteria in your gut. You're not hurting them, they're not hurting you, but together you have a better chance at survival. They help you digest your food better. In exchange, you give them a home, you give them the source of the food, and a little bit of water. The perfect environment for them to live, but nobody's being hurt. Symbiotic associations are the norm, not the exception, all across the world in every type of environment. Without these, nothing is going to survive, especially plants that have a lot of symbiotic associations themselves. Moving on to another culprit that everybody is just absolutely convinced is killing their trees, Spanish moss. Also different forms of it called ball moss. You see it on trees, you see it hanging off of the fence, you see it hanging off a light line, even the side of a house. These are not harmful in any way to plants. They are not parasites. They're actually epiphytes. That means that they're getting moisture from the atmosphere. They have no roots. They have no ability to penetrate a plant to take nutrients or water away from it. So these are not damaging in any way. Like with lichens, do you tend to see these on trees that have gone downhill or died and see them in higher abundance? Sure, it's easier to establish and catch hold in the wind on one of these plants as a support. Now, I will say that heavy loads of this, when it gets really heavy, and especially when we have a lot of rain and there's a lot of moisture in it, can break limbs. So if you do find that you need to remove it, or if you just don't like it and want it gone, mechanical removal if necessary. So removing it by hand is pretty much your best bet. No kind of chemicals, no kind of pesticides needed whatsoever to try to control this. Same goes with the lichens. And in some cases, we've seen people with lichens that have actually tried to remove them and took off the bark. And obviously, they killed the plant if they removed the bark. But they're convinced it's a lichen, but you know better. One to the winged elm. Winged elms are absolutely beautiful. Very beautiful canopy, shade trees in the environment. Like you see here in the bottom of your slide, we had one in our demo garden at the extension office and until Hurricane Irma came through, actually. But these are very beautiful, almost bulletproof plants in the environment. But they do have an unusual characteristic. If you notice here along the stems and the branches, they have these natural corky parts of the branch, almost flaky, if you will. It's unknown if they're beneficial, but more than likely they are, or the plant wouldn't develop them. We definitely know this is not a disease, it's not a parasite, it's a normal part of the plant. But you will get a lot of people that will approach you, and you will be able to recognize it from the typical classic elm leaf here. You'll be able to recognize it because there's really nothing else that looks like this in the environment, and you'll very quickly be able to say, this is not a parasite, this is not a disease, this is a normal part of the plant. Enjoy it because it's something unusual. Our last one that I want to go over here real briefly with you is sooty mold. Now, as the name implies, mold, most people think, well, gosh, it's got to be bad. Again, we find this very frequently on our plant leaves, sometimes on our outdoor furniture, the siding of a house, even a car. But it is not a parasite. It is not a disease. It's very superficial. If you note right here, you could take your thumb and literally wipe this away or use a strong stream of water to rinse it away. If this was actually a parasite growing into the plant, you wouldn't be able to scrape it away very easily. What we have here is a fungus. This is caused by a fungus, but it's feeding on honeydew. Honeydew is the dropping from insects. Now, insects that like to feed on plants like aphids and scales and mealybugs are getting a lot of sugars, the carbohydrates from the plant. And the fungus absolutely loves the honeydew. And so its droppings from the insects are full of carbohydrates. The fungus is literally consuming the honeydew and living out its life right here on the leaf. But what it does tell us is that we probably have an insect problem. Along the stems, under the leaves, we need to be looking for insects that can do our plants some major harm. You control the insects, usually with some soapy water. You're going to control the sooty mold, and then you can just simply rinse it away, or it'll wash away over time. A really heavy infestation could potentially block out a little bit of light and do a little bit of damage in terms of photosynthesis, but that would be absolutely almost unheard of. But there is a little potential for that. So again, very superficial, nothing to be worried about except maybe on the insect side of things. Something you will very commonly get calls, pictures, people bringing in samples or approaching you at festivals, booths, or Ask a Master Gardener tables. And a little bit of info very quickly, and look how much you know about mistaken identities. I look forward to seeing you in class, and I hope you have enjoyed Part 2.